Human beings have been sailing the world's oceans for thousands of years. Nobody knows when the art of boat building began, but it's fair to say that it's evolved a lot over the centuries. The ships we build today are almost like floating towns, full of the kinds of luxuries and amenities that our forefathers could only dream of. As the new comes in, though, the old gets left behind. From stunning shipwrecks to beached boats, here's an amazing collection of abandoned vessels. Let's start off with a shipwreck that appears and then disappears every few years. You'll sometimes find it on Short Sands Beach, York, Maine, USA. If you're lucky, you'll visit on a week where the carcass of an old colonial-era sloop has been exposed by a recent storm or a shift in the sands. Most of the time, though, it remains hidden. The ship's called the Defiance, and it was only identified during its last appearance in 2020. Prior to that, its elusive nature made it difficult for researchers to study it. After taking samples from the skeletal wreck, scientists were able to date the cargo ship to around 1753. The age of the vessel, its shape, and its 60-foot length are all good matches for the Defiance. 18th century records tell us that the ship left Salem for Casco Bay in Portland in 1769, but didn't complete the journey. A stockpile of pork, flour, and other food supplies was lost with the vessel, which was probably pushed ashore by a storm. The wreck is in too delicate a state to be moved, so it will be left on the beach to make occasional appearances to the public until it completely disintegrates. We know where the wreck of the HMS Cerberus is, but we don't really know what happened to the ship to cause its sinking. Marine archaeologists hope to solve the mystery by retrieving artifacts from the wreck. They've pulled more than 300 back to the surface so far, but they are yet to reach any conclusions. The ship went down during the Franklin expedition of the 1840s, a British naval mission that set off to find the Northwest Passage, led by experienced Captain Sir John Franklin. The mission was a total disaster. They set sail in May 1845 but became trapped in the ice close to King William Island in 1847. A note left behind in a cairn by the crew tells us that Franklin was dead by 1848, and the crew had fled their still trapped ships in search of shelter on the land. They were never seen again. The wreck of the Cerberus was finally rediscovered in 2014 after researchers spoke to local Inuits. Such are the conditions here that it's only possible to access the wreck for 5 weeks each year. In 2020, archaeologists managed to scavenge wine bottles, wax seals, a hairbrush with hair strands still attached, and various articles of clothing. The crucial clue to the ship's sinking is still down there somewhere. Why settle for one shipwreck when you could see 15 of them at once? Shipwreck tourism is a niche interest, but there are people and places that cater to it. One of them is Tangalooma Island Resort in Queensland, Australia. Rather than being a maritime disaster zone, this is a place that ships have been taken and sunken on purpose. Between 1963 and 1978, Queensland's state government bought and sank 15 obsolete vessels to create anchorage for new ships. Aside from serving that purpose, the wrecks have turned out to be ideal homes for several varieties of marine life. That marine life forms thick layers around many of the ships, so it's hard to identify them, but one of them is the Maryborough, launched in 1885. The distinctively shaped wrecks of the Bream, the Pelican, and the Maurong are also plainly visible. All 4 of those ships are open to divers, who are frequent visitors to the area, along with guided boat tours. Even if the ships don't interest you, it's one of the very few places in the world where you'll find more than 100 different species of tropical fish clustered together. As World War II came to a close, many of the German vessels that hadn't already been destroyed were seized by the Allies. One of them was a heavy cruiser called the Prince Eugen. The vessel was captured by the British Royal Navy and then given to the US Navy in 1946 as a war prize. The Americans immediately knew what they wanted to do with it. They loaded the ship full of oil and cargo, towed it to Bikini Atoll, and started testing atomic bombs on it as part of Operation Crossroads. To their surprise, the robust vessel stood up to the repeated bomb strikes. It suffered serious structural damage, though, and eventually sunk 3 months after the first explosion. Unfortunately, it still had nearly 3,000 metric tons of oil on board at the time. In a highly questionable move, the Navy towed the toxic ship to the Marshall Islands in 1986 and washed its hands of it. In 2018, the US government finally accepted responsibility for the wreck and sent a salvage team to pump away the oil. They cleared away 229,000 gallons, thus apparently making the ship safe to visit for divers. We're not sure how close we'd want to get to a ship that was hit by an atom bomb, but to each their own. If Canadian tourists want to go and see Niagara Falls, the best route to take is the QEW from Toronto. During the drive, you'll see an enormous abandoned ship in the water close to the road. Most people probably never think twice about it, but if you've ever wondered what the ship's story is, we've got all the details. The wreck is a ship called La Grande Hermine, which is an impressive sounding name until you realize that it translates into English as the Big Weasel. It's a replica of the ship that the legendary explorer Jacques Cartier sailed the world on during the 16th century. The original was long lost, but the first replica was taken to the Expo event in Montreal in 1967, after which it became a floating restaurant. That version of the ship was destroyed 30 years later in Quebec City. The version of the Grande Hermine that exists as a wreck today is actually the third, and is nowhere near as old as it seems. It was built by an entrepreneur who wanted to redo the floating restaurant business, but the business never got off the ground, and then the ship went up in flames in a suspected arson attack in 2003. It's been left to rot ever since. If you were able to make a list of all the materials you might build a ship out of, concrete probably wouldn't be very close to the top. Nevertheless, the idea of concrete ships was briefly popular because of a shortage of materials and resources during and after the Second World War. Every nation involved in the war investigated the possibility, and you'll find the remains of the American attempt at Cape Charles in Virginia. The wrecks are known as Kiptopek's Concrete Fleet. There are 9 vessels here in total, and all of them had already been written off by the Navy as obsolete or unfit for purpose when they were dragged here in 1948. Upon arrival, the bilge cocks of the ships were opened so they'd slowly sink to the bottom of the bay, thus becoming a barrier around the Chesapeake Bay ferry terminal. They're barely any use as a barrier anymore. The holes in some of them are so big that you could sail a small ship straight through them. Tourists like to get up close with them for photographs, but the local government warns against it on the grounds that any of the concrete ships could collapse at any moment. Shipwrecks from the Second World War are plentiful, and they're relatively easy to find. Shipwrecks from the First World War are harder to come across, but they're out there if you know where to look. Take a look at Fraser Island off the coast of Australia, for example, and you'll find the wreck of the SS Mahino. The vessel started life as a ferry to take passengers between Australia and New Zealand in 1905. She was considered a luxury ship and even had a music room with a grand piano aboard. When the First World War began, the SS Mahino was requisitioned and repurposed as a hospital ship. She served with distinction and survived the war, so she went back to her old job after it finished, remaining afloat until 1935. The ferry ship business was in decline by then, and the SS Mahino was showing her age. Her owners sold her to a shipbreaker's yard, but the ship seemed to have other ideas. She broke free of her tow line as she was being dragged away, drifted into the path of a cyclone, and ended up beached on Fraser Island. It proved to be impossible to move her, so she's stayed put ever since. The River Clyde in Scotland features numerous landmarks, but none are as famous as the so-called Sugar Boat Shipwreck. Despite its local fame, though, very few Scots even know its real name. The ship is actually the MV Captainis, which took a battering during a severe storm on January 27, 1974. She wasn't even sailing down the river at the time. She was moored up with a cargo full of African sugar bound for a refinery in Greenock. The storm ensured that she never made it. Winds of 60 miles per hour ripped the Captainis away from its moorings and put it adrift. The crew were still aboard, and so Captain Theodrakis Ionis ordered the engines to be started and followed emergency protocols to the letter. Sadly, nothing could be done. As he tried to navigate the ship toward the relative shelter of Gerlach, it hit the anchor chains of a huge oil tanker. The chains tore a hole in the side of the Captainis, and the vessel was doomed. With his ship taking on water, Captain Ionis ordered the crew to aim for a nearby sandbar. His bold move saved the lives of everyone aboard. The ship ran aground, and the crew was rescued. The Captainis keeled over the next morning and has never moved since. The wreck of the Edouard Bowlin in Namibia is noteworthy for several reasons, but the biggest of those reasons is the fact that it's a very long way from the coast. In fact, it's in the middle of the desert. You'd be entitled to wonder how it got there, and the answer is that the shorelines of the Skeleton Coast have changed a lot since the Bowlin met with disaster. Nobody's quite sure what happened to the 300-foot-long vessel, other than it somehow managed to run aground in September 1909 and couldn't be refloated despite efforts being made for several days. The shoreline has since receded by more than 1,000 feet, leaving us with the impression that the wreck somehow dropped here out of the sky. It's not the only wreck here. As you can see by the broken pieces of timber and steel that surround it, but it survived the passing of the last century a lot better than its neighbors have. Tourists occasionally come along to take a closer look at the wreck, but that's a dangerous game to play. A family of jackals set up home in the Edouard Bowlin about 20 years ago, and they're very hostile to humans. The HMS Cerberus has a place in history as the nation's only surviving intact colonial warship. It never saw a single day of action, but we can't hold that against the vessel or its wartime crew. Back when the Cerberus was built in 1870, Australia was still a British colony. It was originally part of the Victorian Naval Fleet, but became part of the Royal Australian Navy after the formation of the Commonwealth of Australia in 1901. The ship remained in service until 1924, but never quite made it to the wrecker's yard after retirement. We can probably chalk her longevity up to the fact that she was already thought of as old by the time the First World War broke out. Rather than being sailed into battle, she was turned into a floating munitions store, and then later a supply ship for submarines. In 1926, she was scuttled in front of Half Moon Bay to act as a breakwater preventing intense waves from troubling tourists on the beach at Black Rock Yacht Club. Parts of her superstructure collapsed in 1993, but the Cerberus continues to float defiantly. An Australian flag still sails proudly above her smokestack. Describing the wreck of the BOS 400 as a shipwreck might be stretching the definition of what a ship is. We don't mind doing that, because it's a spectacular wreck. The BOS 400 is actually a crane barge, although it might be more helpful to think of it as a floating oil rig. It's stranded in the water just off the coast of Cape Town, South Africa. She was an enormously expensive loss for her operators when she got stuck in 1994 because she was yet to begin active service. The BOS was almost, but not quite, in her planned position when a storm erupted. The massive weight of the BOS 400 meant that she was untroubled by the storm, but the smaller vessel towing her didn't have that advantage. The tug lost the tow rope, and without the rope there to guide it, the BOS 400 drifted across the water and smashed into the rocky shore of Sandy Bay. The damage caused by the incident was catastrophic. The costs of rescuing and repairing the crane barge were deemed to be more than the vessel was worth, so the French company washed its hands of it and decided to make it South Africa's problem. How charming! Most ships need a crew to help them sail the oceans, but the MV Ulta isn't like most ships. She can apparently travel long distances all on her own. She was launched as a cargo vessel in 1976 and served for more than 40 years, but in September 2018, she suffered a sudden and unexplained loss of electrical power while sailing from Greece to Haiti. The crew were stuck aboard their lifeless vessel for 20 days before the U.S. Coast Guard finally reached them. By then, they'd drifted into Puerto Rican waters. The Coast Guard tried to secure the ship but was unable to do so, so they elected to airlift the crew to safety instead. The MV Ulta then turned and left Puerto Rico's waters and headed out back to sea alone. She was presumed lost and written off, but in February 2020, she shocked everybody by arriving on the coastline of County Cork in Ireland, there becoming stuck. Even after a year and a half alone at sea, she seems to have been undamaged until she hit the Irish rocks. Various options have been considered for her removal, destruction, or preservation, but as of September 2021, she's still trapped where she ran aground in Cork. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and enjoy watching new videos on my channel. Thanks for watching and see you soon!